Hello, everyone. We have a couple hundred people already in the live chat. Welcome, everyone who is joining live. I'm so excited to do this. We haven't done a YouTube live since 2020, since the pandemic really started. We did a series of, I think, 3 or 4 different live videos. Hi, everyone. So welcome to everybody if you're joining live and if you're watching the replay. Yes, there will be a replay. So if you only can catch part of it, of this live, then don't worry. It's going to be posted to my YouTube for a replay a little bit later. Of course, you're so welcome. I love doing these live classes. I used to teach in-person watercolor classes for about 7 years, and then 2020 happened and that slowed down, obviously, and I haven't done any in-person workshops. So doing these live classes is always super fun for me. So obviously, let's just get right into it. So obviously we're going to be doing a watercolor workshop. I have my watercolor pigments over here, 20 different pigments, all from my Mary Blue watercolor line. You can use any paint that you have. I personally prefer to use professional or designer level paint versus student or Cotman level. If you have student or Cotman level, no worries. However, there will be slight differences in the richness of the pigment, how it mixes, etc. There are still tons of watercolorists that use Cotman level. I just personally prefer professional level. Every artist is different. But one of the more important things that I want to talk about, we're just going to talk about supplies first, and then we'll get into a couple different paintings that we're going to do today and technical stuff that we're going to talk about. The paper that I love using is this Saunders Waterford from St. Cuthbert's Mill cold press paper. So I like working on cold press paper. There's hot press, cold press, and rough paper. And personally, cold press, the toothy texture of the cold press paper is the perfect little blend. It's not as rough as rough paper, but it's going to grab and hold onto that wetness and that pigment while it dries. Personally, I do not like working on hot press paper because it's too smooth. And so it doesn't have that rough texture that cold press or then rough paper will have. And so when it's too smooth, I personally don't like working on too smooth of paper because of the way it dries and how there's a little bit more finicking that you have to do because of hard lines happening a little bit too easily. So one thing I do want to mention, if you don't have this particular paper, there's still a lot of other amazing brands. I love Fabriano. I love Arch paper. Legion Stonehenge Aqua is another good one. So work with what you have available to you. And like I said, every single artist is going to be different on their preference. This is just a nice cold press paper. It feels similar to Fabriano, but it's not as expensive as something as like Arch, for example, is really expensive. I love that paper, but it's super expensive. And it's also a little bit more rough than what I would think is a normal, typical cold press paper like this one. So I really like working on this paper. Find a paper that you really love. I would recommend working on a paper that is 100% cotton paper. I get messages all the time from people saying like, why is my pigment doing this? Or why isn't it bleeding perfectly? Or why is this hard line around here? Or why is the pigment, like the granulated pigment, separating from the water on my paper? Typically, that's because you're not working on 100% cotton paper. And it's either a blend or it's cellulose paper or whatever. And so it's not absorbing and holding onto the pigment while it dries. And so that separation will happen. There's a lot of other things that we can talk about in terms of fugitive colors and separation as well, but we won't get into that. I've talked about it pretty in depth on my channel. If you're curious, go ahead and scour through those videos after this class. But next, let's just move on to brushes. So kind of my staple brushes that I will take and travel with me at all times, or if I am getting asked what brushes do you recommend I start with, there are going to be, let's grab this, a few brushes that I recommend you get started with. So maybe you're a total beginner and you don't have any brushes or you just have one. I think having on hand a few different sizes of round brushes is really helpful. So I have a size 2 that's kind of acts like my fine liner brush for when I want to do thin lines and details. Size 6 brush, that's my favorite round brush size. I like to use it for florals, for trees and landscapes and whatnot. And then I also have a size 16 round brush for any of my fatter, broader strokes or for flowers or landscapes. My all-time favorite brush is a filbert right now. I'm obsessed with filbert brushes right now. This brush in particular, the size 12 Princeton Velvet Touch brush, comes out at the end of this month. So you guys, if you follow me on Instagram or even on this YouTube, you've maybe seen me talk about this brush. It's a collaboration I've done with Princeton, and it's a size 12. It comes out at the end of this month, but they also have already available a size 8 in the Velvet Touch. And I love filbert brushes because if you'll notice the shape of the brush, it's got a natural kind of oval shape, rounded rectangle shape. And so it's the perfect shape for a flower petal. So you really don't have to put much effort into painting a flower petal if you have it already built into the shape of the brush. So I am obsessed with this brush, and then flipping it on its side will give you a nice little kind of almost leaf shape to it. So it really is, with little to like minimal effort, the perfect flower brush. So we're going to be using that in a painting today. And then having a good wash brush or mottler brush on hand is also a recommendation of mine. I think I saw a comment asking where this brush holder is from. It's from Sylvan Clayworks, along with this palette and this palette up here. Boop. So if you're getting set up and you are going to be painting with me live today, I have 2 cups of water that are off frame. You can't see them. 1 cup is for rinsing off my cool colors. The other cup is for rinsing off my warm colors. If you can't keep track of when you have a warm color or a cool color on your brush that you want to rinse off, just do dirty cup of water, clean cup of water. So with watercolor, we use a lot of water, obviously. That is one of the main parts of the medium, is using pigment, wetting it, and using water to move it on paper. Along with that, we're going to be using a lot of wet and wet technique. And so there's a couple exercises that we're going to do to get started. I'm just going to use my round brush and we're going to dive into it. But to really understand the way watercolor works, because it's going to be different than acrylic, it's going to be different than oil. Also, sorry for the camera zooming in and out. It's really difficult to get live videos like dialed quality wise. And so the web camera, it only has autofocus, so it just picks up my hand every time I go in front of it. So I'm going to grab some Prussian blue, and we're going to do what's called a tea to butter exercise. So if you're not new to my channel, then you probably watched our video on the tea to butter exercise. So just to get everybody who's watching on this live and the replay caught up to us on this whole how does watercolor work thing, we're going to do the tea to butter exercise. It's one of my favorite exercises. It really unlocks how this medium works, because we're not really building much, like, it's not an opaque medium. It's a transparent medium. It's a water-based medium. So it's opposite to acrylic or oil, where you technically can water down acrylic paint and get it transparent, but this medium in general, just to get started, is already pretty transparent. And so how do we lighten a color? So without using any white paint, yes, you can use white paint, but to get the full range of values with our watercolor colors, how do we lighten our color? Or another question I get often about watercolor is, how do I know how much pigment or water to have on my brush? Or when do I know if it's too much water? So this exercise is really going to help clear that question up a lot. So my answer to that question is, it really depends on what you're painting. So for example, if I'm trying to paint a really pale, mostly transparent background wash, maybe for a big sky or the ocean or something like that with this blue, then I'm going to use a lot of water, because I need to go all the way across my paper maybe, or fill up the entire sheet of paper with that color. And so I need to be able to move that color and have a clean coverage and blend between all of my strokes. So I'm going to need a lot more water than if I want something to be really opaque and thick and buttery. So to kind of grasp how this medium works, I want you to, if you're painting along with me, take a wash brush. You can take a round brush. It doesn't matter what type of brush you use for this. And we're going to go from tea to coffee to milk to heavy cream and then to butter, so that we can really grasp the consistency and the ratio of pigment and water in order to grasp when you would use each one of those values on that scale of tea to butter. So to get started, we're just going to grab water. I'm basically dipping my brush in my water cup, and I'm just going to swipe off a little bit on the edge of the cup to get rid of any excess droplets, because you don't really want anything that's going to be like a puddle on your paper. We're just trying to show, basically, if I were to spill some tea on my paper, that tea would just barely stain the paper. It would be mostly transparent. So literally picture spilling green tea or black tea or something like that. Something that hasn't been steeped for very long, because you can get even a full range of different values within how long you've steeped that tea for. So let's say we've just steeped it for about 20 seconds. So we have a very, very light, mostly obviously transparent value of this Prussian blue hue. And then I'm going to go back over to my palette and I'm just going to dip in there and grab a little bit more blue, the same amount of water on my brush. And I'm going to gradually increase the opacity or the depth of that color. And let's say this is now coffee. So tea to coffee. Coffee would still be mostly transparent, but it would be a darker pigment if I spilled it on the paper. So I'm just going and I'm dipping, just kind of scooping out a little bit of my paint over here and adding water to it so I don't grab too much paint on it, so I can gradually increase the depth. And just gradually grabbing a little bit more pigment with each swatch. So then my next one, grab a little bit more, because this is not an exact science. You will oftentimes have to go back and grab more paint, or maybe pick it up with a paper towel or add more water. So my next swatch is going to be milk. Think more like whole milk, not skim milk or anything like that, not a watery kind of milk. We want to think that full fat, whole milk for our third swatch. So tea, coffee, milk, think whole milk. So whole milk, this type of value, this swatch right here, I use this a lot for my midtones. So if I'm painting the ocean, for example, my third book, Everyday Watercolor Seascapes, is all in the ocean. So I have ocean on my mind. I've been writing it recently. So if I want to paint the ocean, for example, my base layer would be this tea swatch. It would be really light, really transparent, and I would sweep it all the way across my paper. This is obviously just a little example, so I'm not doing it exactly how I would. So my first base layer would be tea, and then maybe I would jump in between coffee and milk to then get my wet and wet values, mid-tone values of waves. So this is done with wet and wet technique, because the base layer, the tea layer, is still wet. I'm going on top of it with my milk layer for these waves to kind of blend and blur into the tea base layer. So this is called wet and wet. And then to add more depth and dimension, I would wait for that to dry. And then I would start to add more of a cream, a heavy cream. So this would be my heavy cream swatch, a little bit more pigment actually. This is a 3/4 inch size wash brush from the Princeton Aqua Elite series. So my next swatch, this cream consistency, heavy cream consistency, is probably my favorite consistency to paint with, this one and butter. A lot of times when people take my in-person workshops or are in my art retreats, they're actually quite surprised with how much butter, like thick buttery paint I use and I paint with. I paint really thick sometimes. So obviously we use these tea, coffee, milk ranges for that blurry, blendy, washy, magical stuff that's happening with watercolor, especially in wet and wet. But I love getting really thick and dark, opaque colors with the heavy cream. So when this dries, or even now, I would kind of go over these waves and start to add a little bit of a thicker color. The thicker colors, like heavy cream and butter, are not going to blend as much or bloom as much as the lighter colors, because these colors or values have a lot more water in their ratio. They're going to burst and bloom and blend a whole lot more than the colors that have thicker pigment in them, because they're thicker, they're stiffer, they're not going to blend as aggressively. So I can go over while this is still wet and add a little bit of these cream values to add more dimension. We're just doing this really quick. And then we have our final swatch, our final value, which is butter. Picture spreading butter on toast, really thick. You're going to get a lot of texture. So basically think wet paint straight from the tube, or if your pigments are dried in your palette like mine, you're just going to sit on that pigment and grab a lot of it, and it's going to take a little bit. So this is butter. So really, really thick. You can see all of the strokes, the dry edge texture from that stroke, and it's really thick. So again, this might look like you're working with a medium more like gouache or even acrylic, but this is watercolor. You can get it really, really thick. And that is probably one of my favorite consistencies to paint with is actually butter. So as you can see, I'm striping this butter in while the base layer is still wet and it's not blending very much. So if you want to add any details to your realistic paintings or dimension to any kind of your paintings, the thicker the consistency, the less it will blend. But then also once this dries, you could go over that with an even darker, like adding black to your Prussian blue, and then going over some of that, crisping up some of the edges, the top edges of those waves, and really making that pop. So even though we're just doing all of this using wet and wet techniques, so while the base layer is wet, I'm applying wet paper, we can still see our shadows or our darkest blues, our midtones, which are the milky ones, and even coffee. And then our base layer, which is kind of looks like white, but it's just a barely tint of, just a tiny tint of Prussian blue, our tea stain. So the more I work on this little wave painting, the deeper and more dimension it will kind of pop a lot more. And then we can even, once it dries, we can go on top of these waves with some black, blue, and some white even. If you have white gouache, I love adding white gouache on top of my watercolor paintings to add highlights and like light glimmers. But I'm then using a 35-inch hold. So my brush handle is about 35 inches away from the paper. And just using the very tip or edge of this flat brush, this wash brush, to get in these really thick strokes for my waves. So we don't have to sit here and fuss with this painting too much more, because this was just an example. We're going to go on and paint in a landscape. We're going to paint some flowers. We're going to paint some fun stuff. So that is called the tea to butter exercise. We have a full in-depth video explaining that and how to do it on my YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen that yet, definitely check it out. But that is basically a quick overview of how watercolor works, simply put. So we have two main techniques that we can talk about. First being wet and wet technique. So that's what we did here. We had a wet layer of watercolor. We had our tea, coffee, and milk added to our tea while it was still wet, and it becomes blurry. But if we add our heavy cream and our butter to a wet base layer, it's going to have a very different look or appearance or effect than if we add our lighter, more watery values to a wet base layer. So even within that even within that one technique, wet and wet, there's a lot of different nuances to it depending on the pigment and water ratio that you have on your brush. The tea, coffee, milk, heavy cream, and butter consistency that you have on your brush is going to have a very different appearance on wet base layers, but it's also obviously going to have a very different appearance on dry layers underneath. So the second technique that I talk about a lot on my channel and whatnot is wet on dry. So wet on wet is obviously when two pigments or more touch each other when they're wet, or layer on top of each other when they're wet. Wet on dry is exactly how it sounds. We would wait for this for this to dry, and then we can add our details on top. And when we add details on top when it's dry, we get really crisp lines. So obviously these waves that I added while they were wet are really blurry around the edges. So that is the effect of wet and wet. If I were to do that with the layer being dry underneath it, my lines would be really crisp. The edges would be really hard, and you wouldn't have that blur to it. So different techniques will give you different results. and different effects. So it really depends on what you're painting, when you're painting, and the kind of like the effect that you want to give. So for example, let me grab this floral piece. Was done mostly with one base layer, and then I'm waiting for that to dry and adding the white gouache on top so that it didn't blend. I did not want the white gouache to blend into this like light tan base layer. And so I wanted to wait until that base layer dried so I could have crisp white details on top. Same thing with the bulb of the flowers. I did my base layer with the light yellow, waited for that to dry, added my midtones with this darker yellow, waited for that to dry, added my dark brown, waited for that to dry, added my white gouache. So similar to if you wanted to layer flowers on top of leaves or other details or something like that, you would want to wait for that leaf to dry before adding any pigment on top or adding anything else on top. Because if I added this flower on top of this leaf while it was still wet, it would just become one big blob. That might sound very obvious to some, but it is important when you are maybe painting something that is a little bit out of your range, your skill range, or something new, to really think about, okay, this photo right here, if I'm using a reference photo, that tree looks really crisp. It doesn't look blurry in the background. I'm going to use wet on dry so that it appears really in focus and there's a lot of detail in focus. Or that is in the background, it looks blurry. I'm going to use wet on wet techniques to make it kind of blurry like this. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me look up at the comments. It's hard for me to look in the comments, the chat, the live chat, while I'm painting it and explaining this. So Kelly, my operations manager, and then John, my husband / YouTube expert, have been in the comments, hopefully helping you all out if you have questions and whatnot. So when can I buy the original? Oh my goodness. I have gone back and forth debating on if I want to start selling originals or not. I'm still undecided. So, okay. So that's the tea to butter exercise. Hi, John. Yeah, everyone say hi to John. Everyone say hi to Kelly. They are so helpful, helping me keep on top of things in the chat. Do you stretch your pieces after you paint them? No, I do not. I'm self-taught, so I do things differently than a lot of more traditionally trained artists. So, okay, so let's move on. We're gonna now combine what we just learned with the tea to butter exercise for a landscape painting. So I'm gonna use my wash brush again. So we're gonna be doing like a simple, washy, blurry landscape painting with a wash brush. So I've got my 3/4 inch wash brush from the Princeton Aqua Elite series. Any type of flat brush will work. You can even, if you have, this is the Snap series wash brush, 1 inch from Princeton as well. That's a good one. I also have their 1 inch Mottler brush from the Aqua Elite series. That's awesome. So I'm just gonna go like right in the middle here. I'm not gonna go all the way around my piece of paper, but let's do a couple different landscapes. So let's say I'm wanting to just do a basic, yeah, my blouse color is very vibrant and the other sleeve is red. It's like color blocky. Okay, so this brush, I'm gonna use a lot of water, just plain water. There's a little bit of Prussian blue on it because my cup of water, I rinsed off the Prussian blue, so it has a little tint of blue on it. So I am using a lot of water. So it's basically like if I were to hold my brush up, it would be dripping. There would be water dripping on my paper because I am going kind of painterly with this. I'm not doing crisp, straight edges, and I'm not going all the way to the edge of my paper. I am working very quickly because we're going to be using wet and wet technique, and I'm going to show you a couple different ways that you can use wet and wet technique with our landscape. So first, I'm going to lay down just plain water on my brush. As you can see, I'm trying to go the full width of the paper with my strokes. I'm not going short strokes, because then it's going to show where your strokes are in your piece. So sweep all the way across all the way across to get a really even, smooth coverage of, especially when you add color to this, you don't want to just like kind of hatch in unless that's the style you're going for. But if you want really smooth, kind of a gradient look, you want to go sweep all the way across the paper, big, broad strokes all the way across. So I know that this is good and wet because I can see it kind of glimmer sheeniness on my paper. So I know that I can use wet and wet technique here very effectively. The colors that I add to this are going to blur and blend just how I want them. So I'm going to start with what I like to call poking, or in this case, it'll be dragging. So I'm grabbing a butter consistency on my paintbrush of Prussian blue. So I have a lot of pigment on my brush, thick like butter, not as much water, more pigment than water on this. And I'm just going to drag it at the very top of my wet section and just kind of drag that into it and just go all the way across, because remember, I want smooth coverage. And already that is blending beautifully down into the rest of my wet area. So I can leave it like that, or if I want to kind of show more of a sky, I can flip my wash brush on its side and I can go straight across and maybe go around the sky, kind of like carving out some clouds, some very basic, simple, abstract clouds. So you can, if you want to keep this really wet for a long time, just go back over it and with wet pigment or just water. If you're adding just water to an area like this that has a lot of pigment on it, then it's going to lighten it, and it's also going to cause some spider webby like hard lines around it. So I don't recommend just adding water. You can also use a spray bottle to keep water sections still wet. But like right here, I'm going back over this edge with darker pigment because I want it to be darker, but also to keep it wet. So even still, I'm going back over some of these strokes with darker color, thicker color to darken it, and then to also keep it a little bit more wet. And then let's say we're doing a simple landscape. I'm going to grab yellow ochre and some burnt umber and just kind of mix it in here. I don't clean my palette. That stresses a lot of people out, but for me, I like re-wetting and activating these colors in the future instead of just like washing it off. So I'm going to go right up to the edge of this bottom edge while it's still wet and basically push this sand color into that bottom edge. So depending on how the strength of the pigment that you're adding it to will determine how it blends, but you can also lift and let it kind of do its thing. You can clean off your brush completely and just grab water and scoop that in and just kind of sweep all the way across and up, and it will gradually fade. And this brown, because there's some yellow ochre in it, mixing with the blue is giving us a green. And I'm actually just going to sweep over my sky too with just water on my wash brush to kind of make this a little bit more blurry. Because this is still wet, I'm able to do that. If I'm not working quickly and this dries, it'll kind of just be a glaze on top of it. So we'll just glaze on top of it if it's blurry. It does look like a meadow with brown grass. So then we'll do, thank you for that. I'm going to roll with that.
When do you use raw sienna or raw umber?
So I actually don't ever use raw sienna. So I'm super unfamiliar with that color actually. Because I like to just grab colors and mix them with other colors to my liking instead of like using pigments straight from the tube usually. I mean, I still do that. Obviously, I'm using Prussian blue, pure Prussian blue straight up. But it depends on the color you're going for, really. Like if you're going for a yellow brown, I don't know raw sienna, but if you're going for a yellow brown, I use yellow ochre and burnt umber. If I'm going for a dark, like chocolatey stem brown, then I use burnt umber and carbon black. So yeah, it really just depends on what you're going for. Okay, so while this is drying, there's a little bit of a puddle here. This will happen no matter what level of artist you are at. Sometimes you use more water than you think you need, or, you know, sometimes it just does this. So I'll grab a clean paper towel and just kind of soak it up. I'm not going to dab because that's going to create and lift the color underneath. I'm just going to soak it up as best as I can. And then I'm going to grab that same wash brush, clean it off, and maybe some more of that brown. And then we'll wash it off. Just water on my brush now and just kind of blend that. Because this is still wet, I can do that. That's what is so important and so hard to learn sometimes when we're first starting out with watercolor, is to just go for it and work quickly. Because when you work really slowly, tentatively, or you lack confidence and you're overthinking things, stuff is going to dry and you won't be able to work with it. Can you please show how to use round tip brushes, which you told you will use? Yeah, we'll definitely be doing round tip stuff soon. Okay, so this I can leave just like this. I can also use a round brush like this size 6 and grab just water on my brush and just have a damp brush, not an overly wet brush, and use the tip of my brush with a vertical hold, like 90 degrees away from the paper, and just kind of lift off some of that color in the brown. If I want to go with the meadow look, I can lift some color off to give some light grassy stuff in the foreground. And then when that dries, we can go around that and add darker color for some grasses. So I'm just kind of lifting this off. You can also use a Q-tip, lifting off the color and then getting rid of it on my paper towel. So we don't need to do tons of these strokes, but it creates a fun little look to the grasses. Kind of like there's light shining through this kind of wheat grass or something like that. And then when we add our details later with darker color, it'll pop more. But we'll just kind of go around these lifted grasses, we'll call them. Some of these strokes you have to go over a couple times to really lift the color, but lifting color is a very important aspect of watercolor. So you can lift color if you make a mistake. You can try and lift something off the paper to lighten it or to completely remove it, depending on the color you're using that you're trying to lift, will determine how well it lifts off the paper. So each color is going to lift differently. And also how wet or how dry it is. But then you can also lift color off of your paper. If, for example, you are using a paper towel, a Q-tip, or something like that, and you want to lift off color for the splash of some waves or some clouds in the sky. So I love using the lifting technique to just kind of give that natural texture of just a little tint behind and having a crisp edge around something like clouds. So I just have like a little bit of a like ghost grass. Like they're kind of there, but they're kind of not. And then when this dries, we can come back to it and add darker browns, maybe some dark greens with butter consistency. And then we can really see those light, thin, wispy grasses come through because we'll just kind of carve them out with darker color between each stroke. Would you ever re-wet the paper to get that lift effect? It really depends on the painting. It really depends. If it were like a sky and there was nothing else around, then probably. But it won't lift as strongly as if it was just right away when you put the paint down. So I'm going to set this off to the side to dry and grab a new block of paper so we can move on to some other paintings. So that painting, this landscape, this simple landscape, we covered a couple different techniques to use with wet and wet technique. So we did dabbing or dragging. So we had a whole section of wet background that was basically just water, drug the Prussian blue at the top, and then pushed this brown into the bottom. So dragging on top of a swatch or going away, starting away from the wet swatch area and working towards it and then pushing it into it is another way to get things to bleed and blend. But this is a great technique for getting really smooth gradient backgrounds. Like, for example, I did.
Would you ever read?
I already answered that. For example, I did this. I can't zoom this out, but this is a very large sheet of paper with like a sunset color gradient. So I would use a much larger brush than the 3/4 inch size wash brush for that. And the pink, yeah, that's, what pink is that? Is that Primary Red Magenta from My Mary Blue? Similar to Opera Rose from Winsor and Newton. Yeah, using a hairdryer would be nice right now. We don't have it out here right now, but we do use it from time to time, especially when we're filming and we don't have, can you open this? Struggling to open my new pad of paper. So we're waiting for this to dry. We're going to do some round brush stuff now. So round brush and filbert brush, actually, because I used to only use round brushes for my floral paintings. And now that I'm obsessed with filbert brushes, I use round and filbert brushes as my tag team duo for my floral paintings. So we're going to do a little bit of a basic floral painting, and then we'll do a little bit more complex. So the first one will be just using wet and wet. So we'll have basically one layer to our floral painting. And then the second one will be wet and wet and wet and dry. So we'll have a little bit more depth and layers going on once John gets me the papers. Gracias. So, ouch. Okay, so again, if you don't have a bigger size filbert brush, the size 8 filbert brush works as well. You'll just obviously get smaller petal shapes with the filbert brush than you will with the size 12. So the filbert brush, are there links to the filbert brush? Someone can get them for you. John or Kelly will get them for you. This particular filbert brush, the size 12, comes out at the end of the month. So stay tuned. If you follow me on Instagram or on my email list, that's where I announce like when this will be released. Okay, so for my floral paintings, like I mentioned in the beginning, your filbert brush, the shape of your filbert brush is naturally the perfect shape for petals. So if we're painting flowers, I pretty much always now use a filbert brush for my flowers, and then I'll use my round brushes for stems, sometimes for leaves, but I also really like the filbert brush now for my leaves. So if you have my book, Everyday Watercolor, you might notice that all of my floral stuff, all of my stuff actually at that time was done with round brushes. Well, I have recently been exploring and experimenting a whole lot more in the past couple years. And when I started really using filbert brushes and unlocking how amazing they are for flowers, I just haven't been able to turn back. So I have this size 12 filbert brush, which again will be out in a couple of weeks from Princeton. So this is the Primary Red Magenta from My Mary Blue. It's very similar to Opera Rose. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to paint a floral piece, loose floral piece, using wet and wet technique. So I'm grabbing some of that Primary Red Magenta, and I am going to start with my first flower. So let's think about, before we actually start doing this piece though, let's start thinking about how to paint a flower. So I'm going to start with my first petal. I have the handle of my brush is about 35 degrees away from the paper. So it's a slanted hold. I'm using the belly of the brush, not the tip of the brush. So when I say slanted hold, that literally means the handle of my brush is held slanted instead of pointing straight up and down. Because when I'm straight up and down like this, I'm using the tip of the brush, not the full belly of the brush. So I'm always going to start at the tops of petals, and I'm going to pull it down towards the bulb or the center of the flower. So I am pointing towards the center of the flower. That first petal, that first mark I put down for my flowers is very important. That is my indicator on where to point the rest of my petals. So no matter what, just put your first petal down. Once you have your first petal down, you'll know exactly where to put the rest of your petals. So let's just start with a very simple flower shape, maybe like a tulip or something like that. So this right here, the direction that this flower is pointing to the center point or the access point on my flower. So if we, should I draw this out? This might be more helpful actually. So, this paper? Oh, no, it's not wet. My paper is dry. I do not have wet paper. So if we are talking axis point, here's some really vibrant flowers. The axis point is where all of the petals will be connected and also where the stem will be connected. If you think about a circle or a ball, think about how a flower grows, or like peeling an orange. So we have a ball to start with, and then as we peel that orange, those peels are still connected to that base point. You know how an orange has two little dots or little points on the opposite poles or ends of the orange? Think of those as axis points. So if we have axis points on a flower, we have the base axis point is the most important. That's where all your petals are going to point back to. So if I'm peeling the orange or peeling the flower bud apart, all of my petals will still connect at that base or at that base axis point. So no matter what angle I'm looking at that flower, they're all connected and pointing back to that center axis point. And same thing with the stem. They're all going to connect. So if you're wondering where to place your leaves, once you have all your petals down, point back to that center point, that axis point. So all of your leaves, all of your petals, everything is going to point back to that axis point. So getting back to this little guy, once I place my first petal down, I know where my axis point is. So it's pointing this way. It's not pointing that way. It's not pointing that way. So I know that all of my petals should point back to this spot. So I'm just basically going between using my brush at a slanted hold and scooping it. That's a very buttery stroke. Scooping it and pointing it down to that same axis point. So I've got my two petals down. Maybe I'll just use the edge or tip of my brush to go around the top like this, just kind of showing tops of petals. You can also flip your brush on its side. Instead of having it on its flat part, you can flip it on its side and do these quick little thinner strokes. Lightening the value, so getting more of a tea or coffee value now with my pink for a little bit of a variety in values. That's going to help create movement in the flower, especially with these loose style flowers. But even the petals that are flipping out are all pointing back to that same axis point. So going between using the side of the brush for these thinner petals where the petals are on their side, and then the flat part of the petal so that I get a wider stroke. And then also switching up my values. So we have a flower that became a little bit more complex than a little tulip, but let's go back and do another little flower. So maybe we have this flower pointing up here to the top left corner. Let's now go a little bit lower and maybe point something off to the top right. So I've got my slanted hold pulling down and kind of twisting to an angle to give it that little tip. That's my axis point. So I can go here, I can go here. It doesn't matter where I go from there. All I know is I have to point all of my petals back to that axis point. So now let's go to a petal that's on this side, swooping in. Maybe I'm using the edge of my brush to go around. I like to use the top edge of my brush or the corner of my brush to go around the tops and sides of my petals or flower. And so I've got some light pinks over here. Maybe I do some darker pinks back in here, just kind of dotting up there. So I want to cover up this little area here. And point back to the axis point. Pointing back to the axis point, always. No matter what the petal shape looks like, even if you get the best looking petal shape, if you're not pointing back to that axis point, it is going to look very wonky. So I can get fluffier and fluffier and make this into a peony the more layers I add. So now I'm just adding little dots, lines, edges, tops of petals. I can go back in with some pink and red in a buttery consistency.
Color names.
This is primary red magenta. I'm adding a little bit of primary red and a little bit of, shoot, what is this one called? Permanent orange. So similar colors in Winsor & Newton would be Opera Rose, Scarlet Lake, and Cadmium Orange, if you're using that brand. Some other brands have similar names as well. And then I'll sometimes just go back in while these light layers are still wet with a milky consistency value and accentuate or add contrast to the edges. If you don't have a filbert brush, I'll show you this same kind of painting with round brush in a second. So I'm going in and I'm just kind of adding in slightly darker values while these bases are still wet to make those edges of these petals pop. So we're basically carving out individual petals while it's still wet. So let's say I paint one more flower just to get this going, and then we can do some round brush stuff. Let's say it's pointing down towards me. You can rotate your paper and then you can be painting right side up. But if I were to be painting a flower that's pointing down and not rotating my paper, I'm going to flip my brush upside down like this. Still have a slanted hold, but instead of pulling this way, I'm going to be pulling that way. So I'm going to go, here's the top of a petal. Let me grab a slightly darker color. Top of a petal. So where that points, that is my center point. So my center point is there. So I now know to add all of my petals so that they're pointing to that same spot. So I'll go in with a lighter color here. And they're all pointing You can even do really thin lines with just the edge of the brush. But as you can see, the top of my petal is where I start with the brush and then I pull it down to the bottom of the petal, not the other way around. You're not starting at the bottom and pulling up. Or like here, if I were to do it this way, you're not going like this. You're not flicking up, you're pulling down with the petal. And so now that I have my main petals or flowers down, I can go in with my round brush. So I have a size 16 round. And I'm going to mix up kind of like a blue purpley gray. So I've got sap green. This sap green seems like it has a little bit of white in it. So it already is giving me that softer pastel-y color that I'm going to add cerulean blue. A lot of it. So something like a cobalt blue. And then I'm going to add a touch of ultramarine violet or quinacridone violet. I'm going to show you how to do leaves with both a filbert brush and a round brush. We're going to start with round brush first. So I have this like smoky purple, slightly different stem and leaf color than you might be used to. And I'm going to, where the center or access point is on each one of my flowers is where my stem would be too. So I'm going to go through here and use a vertical hold with my round brush to get these really thin strokes. Because the amazing thing about round brushes is that it's a 2-in-1 style brush. So if you use a vertical hold, you use the fine tip of the brush, so you get thin lines and details. If you use a slanted hold like this, you're going to get a fat stroke. So for example, if I wanted to do leaves with my round brush, let's just get this here, little stems. You're just using, you know how you flick a light switch on and off? That's the motion I'm using with my fingers. So just flicking it to get these really thin wispy lines. And you're just kind of lightly hovering over the paper so that you don't push on the paper and get thicker lines. So if I want to do leaves with a round brush, I am going to come out of that line with a 35-degree hold. So my brush is slanted and it's about 35 degrees away from the paper. And the handle of my brush is going to point the same direction the stem or the leaf is going to point. So I want the leaf and the stem to point in the same direction because the leaf is growing out of that stem. So at 35 degrees, I'm going to put pressure and drag that across and then gradually release. So I use the thin point of that tip of the brush. And then same thing with the bottom side. I like to go between darker and lighter values, so milky or creamy consistencies, and then more tea and coffee consistencies. If you have a lot of color kind of pooling in one area on your wet leaves, just grab a dry brush and soak it up. That will happen a lot more on cheaper watercolor paper. So that is one big reason to invest in good quality paper, even if you are just practicing. So that's with the round brush. Let me show you why I like the filbert brush so much, because I can flip it on its side and just go plop, leaf. Let's grab a little bit thicker paint for more buttery colors. Color mixing gets a lot easier the more you really understand and grasp color theory. So I'm just pulling it down, flicking it like I would flick on and off a light switch. And then sometimes I use the flat edge of the brush and just kind of dot around like that. So we're just kind of dancing around these flowers, kind of like speckled, shadowy leaves, and always making sure that we're pointing back to that center point of the flower. So for example, the stem on this flower wouldn't go here. These petals are pointing back to here. So I'm going to show it here. So flick. Sometimes I like to even go up into the wet pink petals with my stem color, kind of adding some sepal with wet and wet technique. So I've got my thin stem. This one is going down here. So and then I'll go in with my filbert brush or round brush, whichever you have or prefer to use, and dance around with that color for my leaves. But also purple's contrasting color is yellow. And so I'm actually going to go in with some green gold. Green gold is probably my favorite color right now. This is green gold from my Mary Blue. It has a lot of yellow in it. So it's not literally primary yellow, but we are adding a little bit of contrast to that purple with that yellow undertone in this green gold. So incorporating color, harmony, and theory is one of my favorite things to do. Favorite things to do in my paintings. Just kind of dancing between thin strokes, thick strokes. So if I want a thick leaf, I'm going to use a slanted hold and place it on the corner of the brush right there. And just go boop, boop. Or I can use the flat edge of the brush, just like the petals, and do something a little bit bigger. But if I want something thin, then I'll just use the top edge of the filbert brush. And I'll go back to round in just a second. As a mop, as in, can whoever asked the question about the mop, do you mean like a mop brush or to mop up color, or what do you mean exactly?
Oh,
As a mop brush. Not quite, because it's gonna have a lot less floppiness, a lot less like volume in the hair. So you can drag it across your paper like you would use like a wash brush or something, but it definitely has an edge to it that's different than a mop brush. So let's go back to the, you can wet the whole paper with it, but I prefer using wash brushes or mottler brushes over that. Let's go back to the purple and to the round brush. So I've got this flower here. I want to add some stems and leaves over here, but I need to see where the main stem is. It's over here. So maybe I have a stem coming out over there. So knowing where your center or axis point is helpful for placement of every single stem and leaf that you add. Great question. So for composition, I like to start with 3 or 4 big flowers and usually start in one of my top corners. So split your paper into 4 quadrants. You have your vertical line going straight up and down the middle, and then your horizontal line going straight up and down the middle. That's going to give you 4 different segments or quadrants. So treat each individual quadrant like its own painting. So for example, this looks like a complete painting to me. This one, there's a lot more white space, but I might like that. We'll see once I kind of fill out the balance or tipping point of this full one. So this one down here, we still have a lot of work to do to really create a lot of balance. So what I mean by balance and tipping point is, because this has a lot more positive space, so negative space being the space that's not touched, that's just the paper. Because this quadrant has a lot more positive space, it's weighted or heavier than the opposite corner that is unfinished, has a lot more negative space. So if these elements or positive space elements literally had weight to them, like rocks or pebbles, and we put them on a sheet of paper, this corner would tip and be heavier than this corner. And we want to create balance in opposing corners. So for example, this corner is really heavy with elements. I'm going to also put probably another peony or a couple buds down here to fill in that opposing corner so that it doesn't look or appear to look like it's tipping. So that might sound like it's a little over the top or whatever. However, when people's eyes are viewing a piece, whether it's a landscape, floral painting, or abstract, you want to make sure that the tipping point, like it doesn't feel too heavy to one side, because people's eyes are going to view and gravitate towards that area and then want to stay there. So for example, in this quadrant, I'm going to add a whole lot more elements down here. And then I might keep the white space or negative space a little bit more heavy on these 2 quadrants to keep that consistent. So great question on the composition. Let me know if that helps. You can do this with just flowers. So the composition tips, balance, and tipping point can be for just flowers. It's also for landscapes. It's also for abstracts. However, with landscapes, you're also going to start incorporating other composition tips like the rule of thirds, vantage point, perspective, etc., which is a whole nother lesson. I actually cover that a whole lot in my The Art Within course that has a huge section on the foundations, and we talk about perspective, balance and tipping point for landscapes, and then this kind of stuff, composition and layout and developing your style as well. So because of that, because this quadrant is full, I know I'm done with that one, and I need to start moving on down here because this is going to be my second fullest quadrant. These two are going to be a little bit more sparse. However, this one is very, very sparse compared to this one. So we're going to have a little bit more element down here, but I'm going to just start with this one first. So I'm going to grab my filbert again and grab some of that primary red magenta and a little bit of that primary orange. And we're just going to do a couple little buds. So it doesn't literally have to be a mirror of the exact same flowers on the opposite ends. That's not what I mean. Just having the same feel or weight to it on the opposite ends. So for example, I'm probably going to add a couple buds down here. That's going to make it feel kind of even. Not that you want things to be even, like even numbers of things. That's not what I mean either. But for tipping point wise, you want it to have a similar weight. And then kind of through that tipping point, you're creating an S curve or a zigzag with your elements. So I've got a smaller little bud over here that I'm going to leave just like that. And then maybe have one more even smaller one down here. How do you decide what colors to use for leaves? So good question. I used to use reference photos, like referencing photos from my mom's garden or something I found online or whatever, for painting exactly what I saw in the photo. But then the more you grasp and explore color theory and are more familiar with your technique and painting style, the more freedom or confidence that you have to kind of explore other color palettes. So for example, because I design products and stuff, and I really love color, it's helpful understanding how to have more confidence and exploration with color. So for example, I have this really rich, really vibrant pink as my dominant main color. The contrast of pink or red, for example, is green. So I'm not going to use a secondary, like primary green or whatever, because if I were to use that as my dominant leaf color, it would just kind of feel just a little too basic. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but adding in some yellow greens, some blue greens is going to help that if you do use a more dominant or like secondary green. So I wanted to switch it up and give a more feminine, soft look to this color palette. And so having like a smoky violet blue helps to offset that direct contrast. So we have a little bit more blue or purple tones in it now, which if you're looking at a color wheel, you have your three primary colors that sit directly or that are create a triangle away from each other on the color wheel. So let's say red is at the top, blue and yellow. Red and blue makes purple. So we're bridging the gap between blue and red with this purple, smoky purple, and blue and yellow. Between those two colors, we have our green. So we're bridging the gap with our purple and green to our pink and red. So it really helps to understand color theory if you're like wanting to switch it up, mix up different colors, try out new color palettes. But also I really love looking up online, especially on Pinterest, like landscape photos or travel photos and stuff like that to see, just to do research for new color palettes for any type of painting, for florals too. Even if it's a landscape, a photo of a landscape or like something unique and not floral, I'll use that as inspiration for my floral pieces. So now I'm just kind of adding in more of those leaves, stems and leaves to create more balance down in here. And I'm gonna mix up some more of that purpley gray that I just got rid of. More blue, more purple. Mixing colors is not an exact science. So when it's in your palette, you'll kind of get a feel for the direction you want. But adding in contrasting colors, like for example, this blue's contrasting color is orange. If I were to add orange to this mix, it would make it more brown or muddy or muted. So just kind of having an understanding of how color works is very important. So I'm just kind of dancing around these flowers with the edge of my brush, the corner of my brush, the flat part of my brush, and going between my green gold color in lighter and darker values and my smoky blue violet color in lighter and darker values for my stems and leaves. So because there is a little bit of that yellow in this green gold against that purple, we have some contrasting color moments happening. Contrasting colors, when put next to each other in a painting, create contrast, obviously, but when it's done well, they can make the piece feel brighter. They can make the colors feel brighter and more vibrant. They can also cause a lot of strain if they're done improperly. So I like to kind of offset that strain by not having literal yellow next to my literal purple, but having green gold yellow next to a smoky blue purple. So it's not so direct and so intense. So now that we have the 3 quadrants pretty much filled out, we can now see what we're lacking down in our 4th one. So I'm just going to do a tiny little bud down in here. I want my highest point and my lowest point of flowers to be these 2 corners so that they're pulling here. So I'm just going to kind of squeeze this guy here. And maybe another one that's a little bit more pink over here. And just some buds tucked in there for some small floral moments. So we have our small buds kind of all hanging out right here. So I'm just going to try and squeeze one up in here to create more of a zigzag or dance with that. So we're low here, boom. Let's go up in here. Just a little tuck. And then we've got this edge, this white edge down here. This edge is not as flat, so I'm going to go down and add more leaves. Love that bleed, wet and wet with that orange bleeding into that purple. Don't be afraid to work quickly and to just see the magic that happens with watercolor when you just allow it to do its thing. So it's much easier to get really thin lines and stems with a round brush than it is with a filbert brush. So now we're just gonna fill this in. Just being really light and dainty. So really all I'm doing, let me go to a new sheet of paper that I would call pretty much complete. Let me go to a new sheet of paper and show you a broken down version of exactly what I'm doing with my brush to get these strokes. Because if you're really new, you're a beginner to watercolor, that might be really overwhelming to just look at a blank sheet of paper or look at what I'm doing and feel overwhelmed or lost. So let's break it down and get really basic with it. So petal, where's my pencil? I'm going to do a sketch first. So I clean my cups when I'm done painting, or if they are looking really dark and full of color and they're affecting the colors that I'm trying to get and not making them super clean, then I'll clean out my water. So let's just talk about flower shape first. So I'm going to draw an oval. I'm just lightly using my pencil. You don't need to follow along with this, but if you want to, it's helpful. And the direction that my oval is slanted is going to determine where my axis points are. So if I were to divide or slice that oval down the middle vertically, that would indicate my north and south poles or my axis points. So this is the most important axis point on a flower, the base axis point. So once I determine where that base axis point is, I can then know where all of my petals go. I'm just literally drawing ovals that are connected to the bottom of that flower. And I have a very basic flower shape so that when I go in and I add my construction lines, or my contour lines rather, I know where to place them on the flower. This is just doing it really quick. So then we can ignore the oval marks and just see the petals. And my stem would also connect to that same axis point. So let's do another one. You have a ball instead of an oval. North and south axis points. I'm not going to draw them. And all of your petals are pointing back to that center bottom axis point. So we have ovals that can come out and connect here. We can do a shorter oval, like a petal that's pointing up a little bit more toward us. All of them are going to point back to the center of the flower. So we can have petals on their sides. Doesn't matter the shape of the petal because they're all pointing back to that spot. Like so. This is obviously not a sketching lesson. Otherwise, I would do this a lot slower and actually tell you what I'm doing. I cover this a lot in my course, The Art Within. But this is just showing you that literally all the petals, can't draw a straight line, are pointing back to that axis point. If they aren't pointing back to that axis point, so for example, here's our axis point. We have a petal pointing to the axis point, to the axis point, axis point. But then let's say we have a petal that we want to put out here and it's pointing over there. That makes no sense. Or we have our stem here and let's say we want to add leaves and we point a leaf that would be pointing down here and connecting to a flower down here that we don't have. So it's really important understanding axis point so that you know where to place your petals. It informs where you place your petals. It informs where you place your leaves, all of it. So now let's do, I know we are running over an hour. I hope you guys are still enjoying this little lesson. But now let's do another floral piece. And I'll break it down a lot more simply with both the filbert and the round brush. We'll start with the round brush because some of you said that you don't have the filbert brush. Let me grab my size 16 with this primary red magenta. And I am going to use, with my round brush, a slanted hold. So I'm about 25 degrees away from the paper. Hello, little blot. And we're going to use that. And I'm going to loop around and point down with the side of my brush. So I'm not pointing it in line with the petal. I'm on its side or perpendicular to the direction that the petal is pointing. So my petal is going to point this way. My brush is pointing perpendicular. So I'm pushing with medium pressure, looping around and down. And then I'm going to just do the flicking motion, like I'm flicking a light switch off, and give it this like fine little line at the bottom for a petal shape. So this, where this is pointing, is showing me where my axis point is. So same thing as with the filbert brush, but now we're using we're using, what is this? A round brush. So I'm going to go, maybe I want to show a little petal on its side. Then I'm going to have a little bit of a higher slanted hold. So more like a 65-degree angle away from the paper. And I'm going to go down with medium pressure for like a thinner petal on its side. And then maybe I will rinse off some of that pigment so I get more of a tea or coffee consistency value with my color. And I'm going to do another stroke with a flatter slanted hold, so 25 degrees. Same thing as the first petal, pressing up and looping back down. That's bleeding into that and it looks beautiful. So we're going to leave that alone and let it happen. Grabbing more primary red magenta or Opera Rose if you have Winsor Newton, and some of the primary orange. And I'm just going to blob that into the tops of some of these petals, because if you've ever seen Eden roses, they have a very pale petal, and they have like darker spots on them on the tops of the petal. So just then I went around with my slanted hold and just kind of did these 3. Like if you're drawing the number 3, I'm doing that with my brush. Boom, 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 making sure they're all pointing back to the center of the flower. And then this one is just up and down, little wavy up and down, like so. And then you can grab thicker consistency of your paint, like butter consistency, so it doesn't bleed or blend as aggressively. See how it's barely moving? And just give a little bit of a darker contrast like an Eden rose would have. You can even stroke in the belly of the petal for like a little line detail like that. And we're going to wait for that to dry, and then we can add stamen and a bulb and whatnot to the center of it when it's dry. Another flower that I love to paint, I'm actually going to do this with Dragon's Blood because it's the most epic color name of all time. It's like this deep red brown. I'm going to grab some of that pigment and rinse it off so that I have a tea consistency. And I'm just going to use the belly of the brush with a really slanted hold and just kind of drag it around in this round shape with points on the edge. And all of those points are pointing back to the center of the flower. So you want to make sure that the angle of those points follows that connection. And then I'll go and grab more Dragon's Blood in a butter consistency and use the tip of my round brush and plop it down for Dahlia. So now we've got this butter consistency of Dragon's Blood kind of defining the edge, those points. Some of these points can be smaller than others. You can use a filbert brush for this as well, but the round brush, the shape of the round brush is just natural. I saw someone say that they're left-handed, so I'll show you lefties. You can use your right hand as a resting place so you don't smudge, and then plop. And then you can not touch the paper if you're resting on your right hand. And then just rotate your brush to follow the center point. So like if the point of your brush was connected to the center point of the flower, that's the direction that your petals, these little sharp points, should go. Do you use your art for surface designs? I sure do. I also have a class on surface design. I've done planners, baby products like play mats and pajamas, phone cases. You can see a lot of this stuff on my website, jennarainey.com. So now I'm kind of going in the middle of the flower where it's lighter, like a tea and coffee consistency, with the buttery Dragon's Blood so that it doesn't blur too much and just become dark Dragon's Blood. And I am adding those points and still making sure to follow that center point. And then I'm going to grab some carbon black and mix it with Dragon's Blood. And I'm just going to place that on a couple outer petals on one side to show kind of like shadow, like it's in shadow over here. There's more light on this side. So we've got a nice little, tiny little dahlia. We can do another dahlia right next to it and get some really cool bleeds by grabbing, I have just water on my brush, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just kind of scrubbing it around on my paper, and then I'm just going to boop, do a little kiss next to that dahlia that I just painted because it's still wet. And then I'm going to grab my dragon's blood again in a milky consistency because we're building depth. So we're not going straight to butter because this is very, very light. So I've got a milky consistency. This is the center of my flower. Point, 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 rotating all the way around with where the center point of that flower would be. What do you mean? So the person who asked you're having a hard time with shadows, maybe clarify what you mean by shadows. The shadows in the video, the shadows on, because we're not really painting shadows in these paintings quite yet. We're adding depth with thicker consistency, but we're not quite adding like realistic style paintings into our repertoire with this lesson. I have a couple of lessons on realistic style painting on my YouTube, and then obviously my Patreon takes it even a step further there. That's where I have a art community where people are interacting with each other, asking questions every month and hanging out. And we have exclusive monthly tutorials for my patrons each month and live art classes like this every single month and live Q&As with me every single month. So I'm going in with this darker dragon's blood and just gradually building the thickness of the color so that it's darker and more opaque and also thicker so it doesn't blend as much because we don't want it to take over. We want to have some of that light color and some of the dark color. Let's say you added too much of the dark color and you want to take some of it out. Rinse off your brush completely, dry it off so it's just barely damp, and soak up or lift up the paint. Swipe off the color you just lifted off and keep going. So this is called lifting again, using some lifting to create a little bit more contrast. And so we've got a couple dahlias. Let's start really quickly filling in this piece with some stems and leaves now. So I've got my 3 main flowers. I've got pink and this deep red brown. So I've got a lot of warmth. This is a more like contemporary color, I would say. This is a more like neutral color. So let's start to blend and merge the gap a little bit with our stems and leaves. So we can do, let's start mixing. So I've got this sap green. I'm going to do like a eucalyptus blue. So we've got sap green, Prussian blue, and I'll add some orange. So if I add black to this to make it smoky, it's just gonna cancel out the color that I have, which you can definitely do. But I'm gonna add some orange to make it still that blue-green undertone, a little bit more blue. But just mute it a little bit with the orange. So then I'm gonna use a lot of water for that silver dollar eucalyptus type color. And we've got a flower pointing this way. So I'm going to go, here's my main stem. So I'm going to make that thicker. Again, light switch motions. So we've got that. Sometimes I even like to do these little 3 motions with my leaves to give like little, with my round brush, little fluffy strokes. So we've got some leaves that show us the neutral vibe. Let's do now something a little bit more vibrant. First, I'm going to do some more of this pink for some flowers to kind of dance in between here. So I'm going to do little buds. So I'm just using the side of the brush with those like kind of brushing your teeth motions to do like this little fluffy guy. Maybe some lighter pink.
Water drying up quickly.
So if your water is drying up quickly, that's just a sign that you're painting too slow and that you need to work a little bit quicker, have a little bit more pep in your step, or you're not using enough water to begin with. So you can always, like, if I wanted this flower to stay wet, for example, this is pretty much almost dry, so I wouldn't do it now. But if I were moving on to these flowers, before moving on to the leaves and these two little guys, I would go back over this with some more pink to keep it wet if I knew I wanted to keep it wet for whatever reason. So I've got this kind of flow here, and we've got our vibrants and our mutes, our little muted neutral colors. We're gonna give these vibrant flowers another pair of vibrant leaves or something, and we're gonna do a purple that bridges the gap between the blue in this green and the red and pink in these flowers. So I'm gonna do, what did I say? Purple? Yeah, it's gonna be more of like a magenta that's close to here, but it's vibrant. So it's like dragon's blood and purple and a little bit of this red, permanent red light. And this might be a unique leaf color, but we're going for it because you get to make the rules. So it's a vibrant purple, but it is very close to this dragon's blood, which is a more neutral red or muted natural color, because we use dragon's blood in it. Dragon's blood and ultramarine violet and permanent red light. So it's a vibrant, rich purple to match the richness of the pink, but bridges the gap with that little bit of dragon's blood in the mixture. So I'm literally just plop, 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 rotating my brush. So sometimes it's actually all of the time, it's very random how I'm rotating my brush. So for example, it's hard to slow it down because it's so in flow and motion. You just have to, so sometimes I'll do these three little guys. Sometimes I'll go plop, sometimes I'll go plop. If I don't like it, I'll grab some more water and I'll just add a little stem and I'll do some bigger leaves to cover it up, like so. But use the shape of the brush, the natural shape of the brush, to your advantage. You can use the round brush on its side with very little water to use dry brush and just go drag and get that natural texture, and then just lift off a little bit for the tip. Let's grab more of that blue, smoky blue-green. Adding more blue to it. And we need some lighter values of this green. So this is a great way to incorporate both bold and vibrant colors and more neutral, less vibrant colors. Now that I have purple on my paper, I can incorporate, not now that I have it, but I want to, because I want to spice this up and make it even more vibrant with some of this green gold. So this is a very vibrant color, but it has like a lot of brown undertone to it. So it's not like bright yellow. It's what we used in the last piece. So that yellow in there is contrasting with the purple. So I'm just getting really confident and going right up against some of those wet swatches of purple and just letting it do its thing. We'll go back to that first landscape that I did once I'm done with this. And now that we're filling that out, I'm going to go in and add a couple more flowers, probably some dahlias. Squish it around. Grab the thicker dragon's blood. Plop, 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 plop. And we'll finish up here in the next 20 minutes or so for those of you who are wondering. Once we finish this, I'll go back and finish that first landscape we did. And we've got ourselves a nice 2-hour live watercolor workshop. Dahlia number 3. Had some dragon's blood still on my paintbrush. So that original mixture is gone, but we can come back to it. So where's the center point of this flower? Here's the main stem. Boom. And then we can go back to this flower. I'm going to do a black center. Use carbon black in a buttery consistency. Slanted hold. Make sure your pink flower is mostly dry. Obviously mine is not, but that is okay. We'll work with it. And then using the tip, because that black is really starting to bloom into the pink, I'm going to grab a dry, clean brush and just sweep it up. And we have our quadrants. So obviously there's some white space over here we're going to fill out. Need some more purple. See how there's a lot of purple right here, not much over here. Still my favorite though, floral wise, is the filbert brush. Huge fan of painting florals with my filbert brush. It's obviously doable with the round brush, but I just like the shape of it better. And you're so welcome. Thank you guys for watching. I love being able to be live with you guys. Okay, we're gonna call it a day on that one, even though I'd probably keep going. The size filbert is the 12 that I love, but this brush isn't out yet. It'll be out in a couple of weeks. This is a Princeton Velvet Touch filbert size 12. I helped create it because they didn't have this size, and I was like, you need a size 12. because it's the best. And so they made it, and it's coming out at the end of this month. All right, let's go back to that landscape. Here's the other floral that we did with the filbert. And we can add some grasses here in the foreground since the background is dry. So now we're using wet and dry technique. So with this landscape, we initially used wet and wet. That's how we got this nice gradient between this brown and blue. So now I can go in with darker browns, darker greens, whatever color you want to. I think I'm going to do a darker value of this color. So yellow ochre and burnt umber. And it's like a heavy cream and buttery consistency. And we're just going to go in and kind of eyeball where I placed those marks and go around. So I'm using a size 6 round brush to flick around where I have these really kind of faint, you can't really see them probably, but these really faint where I lifted the color while it was wet. I'm just going to go around those and kind of frame them with these darker browns. So you can use your size 6 round brush and use a vertical hold and just kind of flick them up. And then I'm doing really thin flicking motions down for really thin strokes. I'm going to add a little bit of red.
Any sales on your courses?
Huh?
Any sales on your courses?
What does that mean?
Online courses, you do sales.
Oh, any discounts? We rarely do discounts to our courses, to be honest. Sometimes we do like bundle offerings. So like you get something at a discount with the purchase of it, but we don't really do discounted prices. So I'm just going to go around and finish up the grassiness at the base here, adding in some chocolatey browns and some redder browns to mix up the values, some yellow browns even. But this is obviously called wet and dry when we're adding details or a layer later on in the painting when the base layer is dry. Whoops, dropped my brush. So almost done. Now I'm just going to go kind of quickly.
Reminder of what brushes you've been using.
So all the brushes I've been using in this whole video, I've been using round brush, size 6, size 16. And filbert, size 12. This one comes out later this month. I don't think I used the size 8, but that's also a good filbert. And then a 3/4 inch size wash brush from Princeton. All of them are from Princeton. If you want to check out the supply list of all of the supplies that I use at all times, go to jennarainey.com/Amazon. And I have a full list of my supplies there. So I'm just going in with some slightly darker browns to add contrast. And voila, we could obviously add hills in the background. We could add trees. We can really do it up, but simply put, wet and dry technique. is a really fun technique to use to obviously build dimension and layers. So here's a couple more examples of wet and dry. This one being floral. I showed this in the beginning of this video. So we have dry base layer of the yellow, adding a mid-tone yellow for more depth. Wait for that to dry, add the brown. Same thing on these flowers. So I add a lot of depth for the stamen of my flowers when the base layer is dry. And here's some big wet dahlias I used with a filbert brush. So we would do the main base layer, very wet and juicy with the filbert brush. I'll show you that really, really quick. I know this is going really long, but I'll just do this in like 2 seconds so you can see how to use a filbert brush for some dahlias. So I'm just grabbing water and I'm scrubbing in that kind of round shape with the belly of my brush. And then I'm going to use the brush on its side like this to do the spikies of the petals. So if we're using dragon's blood, this is why I love wet and wet. Making sure they're all pointing to the center of the flower. Whoops, got way too much paint there. And then because that is kind of swirly in the middle, I would just grab a damp, clean brush and kind of help blend and lift some of that color in the middle, blend it in a little bit. And then you can go back in for some of these other petals towards the center, like that. Grabbing your stem and leaf color, using a vertical hold with the filbert and flicking. Whoops. All right, you guys, that was so fun. I'll take a few questions since I haven't really been able to look up at the chat very much. So I'll take a few questions from those of you who are still on live. And for those who have watched the replay thus far, thank you so much. Or if you joined late, whatever. So just drop some questions. I'm not going to finish that because we'd be here for too long. Drop some questions and I'll start answering. How long have you been watercolor painting? I've been watercolor painting for about 10 years. So my mom painted with acrylic, so we would do it here and there. And my grandmothers on both sides also painted with acrylic, but it was mostly just a hobby. It wasn't like anything serious. Am I wearing a raincoat? No, it's not raining. This is just a little light button up. No, I didn't get my sleeve messy, for those wondering. I know, it's very shocking. I actually wear white clothes all the time and I don't get them messy. It's pretty impressive. Thank you. Have you done line and wash tutorials at all? I don't recall. Oops, where'd that question go? You guys are typing too fast. I don't recall seeing any line and wash. We did one for my Patreon that I did a dahlia, actually just like this with dragon's blood, and I did a lot of ink stuff on top of it. So that's in my Patreon. Happy 2023. If you are having difficulty with the bloom, does that mean you really need better paper? Most likely. It could be the paper. It could also be that you're not using enough water and your pigment is too thick, so it's acting like a wall. But also if you use too much water, the water can act like a wall too. So both can be an issue. So kind of play with that, but definitely paper is one of my first initial go-to answers for if people are struggling with good blooms or if it's drying funky. It's usually the paper not being 100% cotton. That's your problem. Technique to distinguish cool colors from warm. So very simply put, your warm colors are going to stem from the color red. Cool colors will be from blue, but there's so many nuances to it. Like you can have cool reds, warm blues. So it kind of isn't an exact science. Bless you, John. It's not an exact science, but anything that's like red tones, reds, oranges, warm yellows, pinks, red violet is going to be a warm color. And then anything that's closer to blue. So blue violet, violet, blue, blue, green, green, and then cool greens. So greens that have like an undertone of blue in it or cool in it. But look at a color wheel, split it in half, and you will see the warm side and the cool side. I have a good color theory video on my YouTube channel that'll help you with that. Thank you. Let me see. I have my own way of cleaning my paintbrushes. What's your advice on how to clean paintbrushes without damaging them? I just use water. And then when they're damp, I reshape the hair. So I just go like this to reshape the hair. It's mostly important, very important actually, to reshape the hair of your round brush because you want it to always have its nice fine point or tip. So whenever I wash it, I always just kind of stroke the shape of the brush a little bit to get it back to its point and then dry or let it dry flat. Never leave it in your cup upside down or anywhere upside down. Whoopsie. Keeps jumping around in the chat because more comments are coming through. What's your favorite media to use with watercolor? You mentioned ink. Anything else? I like a variety of stuff. It really depends on what I'm feeling for the day. Like lately, I've been really loving adding little like colored pencil marks to things. I love the texture of colored pencil and just the look of it. So it really depends on how I'm feeling that day. But I really, I love watercolor just by itself too, just like this, and not adding any other media to it. So it kind of just depends on the look I'm going for and how I'm feeling for that day. But yeah. When will you do your next live? Really enjoyed this. Well, I have a live every single month in my Patreon. So if you really liked it, go check out jennarainey.com/Patreon. Next YouTube live, we'll probably do these once a year. So January next year for the YouTube. And then again, if you want lives every month, we do that on my Patreon. Thank you for joining. Have you ever painted a hedgehog because these quills? Yes, I have. That was actually one of my favorite paintings. I have it. You can go on my Instagram and find it. If you scroll like really far down, probably like 3 years ago, I posted a little hedgehog. It was super fun to paint. Any chance? Wait. Paper cost is really a great hurdle to learning watercolor. That is for sure. So obviously everybody's going to have different budgets, different preferences, styles, all of that. So if you are really like on a tight budget, try practicing on the back side of the paper. It's not going to have the same finish and results as the front side of the paper. But one of my biggest pieces of advice is that you want to enjoy the process of painting when you're practicing, even as a complete beginner, because that's the number one thing that I see people giving up on watercolor is their frustration and their results. And sometimes all you need to do is have better quality paper or brushes or paint. And so while I do value the importance of sticking to a budget and trying not to waste paper and all of that, it is also kind of a fine line because it's really important that you enjoy the process of painting and not get so frustrated. Please click the like button for Jenna. Thanks, Irene. That's very sweet. What do you do when the tip of round brush gets curled over? Yes, I tried wetting and reshaping. If you tried wetting and reshaping, I mean, you can technically try very delicately to snip it, but that probably means that it's just time to get a new round brush, unfortunately. That's why it's really important. If you do take care of your brushes and you do reshape them after each use, you won't have to replace them. These will literally last you a lifetime. If you are good with your brushes will last you a lifetime. If they are good quality brushes and you are good to your brushes, they will last you a lifetime. But if the tip of your round brush or whatever is damaged, then unfortunately it just won't work like it's supposed to. So that's when I would replace the brush. And that means either I left it in my cup upside down, or I forgot to reshape, or I didn't clean it well and there's some hardened paint in there or something. So if you're good to your good quality brushes, they will last you forever. I'm glad my humor makes you laugh. That's funny. What color pencil brand and watercolor pencils? I don't use watercolor pencils. What colored pencil brand is it? Now. I have this Tombow Irojiten. I think that's Japanese, and I have no idea how to say it. Although I did take a year of Japanese lessons when I was in 5th grade. I can count to 10. Ichi ni sanchi go roku shichi hachi kuju. Anyway, I got this off Amazon like a long time ago. So I'm sure they're good. They feel good to me. I don't know. I barely use them. So if there's better brands out there that people really like, drop them in the chat. I never use watercolor pencils. Any ideas for more new? Whoop, oh, dang it. The comments keep moving around. New courses yet? I still need to finish Art Within still, but I love your courses. We're actually working on a creative business course that comes out in the fall. So it covers like business operations and email marketing and organization and productivity stuff, strategy, all of that, SEO, blah, blah, blah. So more of a business course coming out in the fall. The Art Within is like my staple signature art course though. Let's see. Love this live. We'll watch it again. Yes, there will be a replay. So watch this as many times as you want to. Can John paint? I think if he dedicated more time to practicing, he'd actually be a good painter, but he barely paints. So he's actually done a video on my YouTube where he's taken over the channel. I think it was for Valentine's Day, and he followed one of my tutorials. If you haven't seen that video, it's pretty funny. How would you finish the center of the flower in front of you, or do you consider it done? I consider this done. I don't consider the painting done. I mean, you could go back over some of these strokes where you're seeing like a faint outline of a petal with a darker color for a rich situation, but I really like this fade of the dark to the light, and so I wouldn't touch that. Let me see. When I got myself real brushes, it totally changed the game. Made such a huge difference having good quality products to work with. Abso-freaking-lutely. Huge game changer. Cheap paper gives sad results. Yes, it does. Dang it. These comments keep moving. What do you do if the watercolor doesn't want to bloom a lot? Thank you, by the way. I love your videos. Thank you. If it doesn't bloom, then you can add more water to it and see if it'll move. Like if I'm doing, I hate to mess this little flower guy up, but if I'm doing like a little circle or something, painting, and orange blends a lot. So this was a bad color to start with because this pigment is really strong. But if it's not blending as well or blooming as well, I would just grab more of that orange and I would scoop it in and just kind of cheat or force it to happen. Please write the name of the color pencil. I could not screenshot it. Oh, this IROJITEN. And it comes in these little, it looks like little books. There's 3 of these boxes. So there's 9 altogether volumes, they call them, of different shades of things. So by Tombow. 30 in each one of these boxes, pencils. Way too many for my taste, actually, but it looks cute on a shelf. The spikes. Thanks, Jenna, for the live. Learned a lot. So happy you guys learned a lot. I'm learning so much from you. Thank you, guys. Prismacolor pencils, or if you want watercolor pencils, go with Derwent for pure on color. Good to know. Do you ever use watercolor pencils or markers? No, I mostly just use watercolor paint, obviously. Watercolor ink is also one of my favorite mediums. I get watercolor ink from Dollar Rowney in Bombay, and I mix them together to get the hues that I want and put them in these plastic jars. These are linked in my Amazon shop, which is jennarainey.com/Amazon. But watercolor inks are awesome. I have a couple videos on my YouTube of watercolor inks. And then I also use gouache, which is like an opaque version of watercolor. The gouache I use is from My Mary. So the watercolor line from My Mary is My Mary Blue, and then they have a gouache line, and it's awesome. So I love using gouache. I've also just started recently exploring with acrylic paint, with this liquid acrylic paint, because I'm wanting to experiment and do new things. So, but as far as watercolor markers and pencils go, I have never tried them. Thank you. Do you also use granulating colors? Yeah. Well, actually not anymore, but I used to use Winsor & Newton Opera Rose, which is a granulating color. And I just don't care. I also don't sell originals. That's funny you mentioned you learned to count 100 in 5th grade. My granddaughter, who's now living in Spring Valley, California, and is now in 5th grade, her teacher is teaching them to count in Japanese. How random. I also know head, shoulders, knees, and toes in Japanese. I'm not going to sing that. Yeah, autocorrect. Spell check got me the first time. Thoughts on black watercolor paper? I don't personally like using it, but if I were to use it, I would actually use gouache, because gouache is more opaque than watercolor, so it would be more vibrant on it. I think it's a cool look, but it's just not my vibe. It's not my style. And I scan all of my work to then design patterns and stuff, and so it's just a better look to have it on white paper. I'm glad it was informative. Do you have tutorials to paint puppies? Have I done a puppy tutorial? I don't remember. I don't think I have. If I haven't, I definitely should in 2023. Hi, I'm not an art person, but want to learn watercolor. What video should I start with? The Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor on my YouTube channel. It's called The Complete Beginner's Guide to Watercolor. So just go to my YouTube channel and then click on videos, and you'll find most popular videos. That's our most popular video. It's like a 3-hour deep dive on watercolor. And then obviously this live, once the replay is posted, this one is good too if you didn't watch the beginning. Gouache is the best. Finding your channel brought so much joy. Seeing one's own growth is stellar, especially if you use a journal to hold the work. I did your last beginner's course. So excited for this one. Thank you. Do you use gum Arabic at all? No. Do you mean drawing gum or masking fluid? If so, sometimes. Okay, I'll get to a couple more questions. Do you use an app to scan your art? If so, which one? I have the scanner that I use in my Amazon shop, and then I use Adobe programs, Adobe Photoshop to clean up the background and color correct if I need to, and then Adobe Illustrator to design repeat patterns. My course, Brand Plus Brand, teaches you all that kind of stuff. Scanning, digitizing, editing, creating repeats, and then also working with product and licensing companies. Thank you for teaching, sharing so many watercolor tips and techniques. Very helpful and enjoyable. Also, thank you to your team. Yes, thank you to Kelly and John for helping. I'm interested in painting rising morning fog over a winding stream on a backdrop of simple mountainscape, the view from my home. Are there any tutorials on how to paint a white fog? I have a misty forest painting in my book, Everyday Watercolor. I also have one on my YouTube channel. However, I would actually recommend checking out Paul Clark's YouTube channel. He is king of landscape. So between those two things, the Misty Forest on my channel and then Paul Clark, you'll be golden. His channel is awesome. What type of music do you listen to when you paint? I have a couple playlists that I like to listen to that I have on my Spotify. I have some vibey indie music for when I'm feeling like I need more upbeat stuff. And then sometimes I just like to have sounds and no lyrics and stuff. So I have another one that's more like ambient behind my painting. So it really depends on the mood. Yes, Paul Clark is the GOAT. What's a granulating color? It's fugitive color. It means that it will fade over time. You'll see a permanence grade level on most paints that will tell you if they're fugitive or not. Like this one says grade 1 here at the top. The poorer the grade, the more fugitive or granulating it will be. But there's a lot of other good info on the interwebs. On the interwebs that will explain that a lot better too. Brand Plus Brand is the surface design course on your website. Yes. JennaRainey.com/brand-plus-brand is the sales page. So you can read more about it. All right, you guys. I'm sure I missed some questions. Sorry if I missed your question. There was a lot. Yes, granulating separates and it also fades. Big love to you all. Happy New Year. And I hope you enjoyed today's live. It was so much fun being live with you all and painting. If you did paint along with me or you end up painting after this, make sure you use the hashtag on Instagram, JR Art School, so that I can see your practice, or tag me, whatever. I would love to see what you do because that was so much fun. But thank you guys again. We'll do this again soon. If you want to do this every month with me, join my Patreon, JennaRainey.com/Patreon for more live videos every single month. And have the best weekend and rest of your day or night, depending on the time zones. I know a lot of people were up in the middle of the night to watch this. So thank you all for joining, and I'll see you on the gram or in future YouTubes. Bye, everyone.